How many times do I have to come out here? You were told to stay inside.
I'm in my doorway. I haven't done anything.
Neighbors called again. You're shouting,
Ryan,
keeping people
hold up, ma'am. Let's just talk this through, okay?
It's just me and my son.
We're not hurting
Then
anyone.
keep it that way.
At 5:47 a.m. on Saturday, March 1st, 2026, a quiet street in Silver Spring, Maryland was still asleep. Porch lights glowed. A few cars sat under a thin layer of dew. Then, without warning, the silence was cut by the low growl of engines and the crunch of tires along the curb. Two dark tactical vehicles rolled to a stop in front of a modest two-story home. Within seconds, 12 Homeland Security Investigations agents poured out wearing full gear, helmets, plate carriers, rifles held tight to their chests. They moved with practiced speed, stacking along the front walk like they were hitting a cartel safe house, not a family residence. There was no knock, no announcement. A flashbang grenade smashed through the living room window and detonated in a burst of white light that shook the entire house. An instant later, the battering ram hit the front door. The first strike splintered the frame. The second sent the door crashing inward. Agents flooded the hallway, shouting commands so loud the walls seemed to vibrate. In the back bedroom, Barbara Okuosa-Admi jolted awake in her pajamas, barely lifting her head before hands yanked her from the bed. She hit the floor hard, face down on the carpet, a knee pressing into her back. Plastic zip ties cinched around her wrists behind her before she could even form a full sentence. And as the chaos swallowed her home, Barbara forced her voice steady and said the only words that should have stopped everything. "I'm a federal judge. I'm a sitting United States federal judge." Down the hallway, the chaos spread from room to room like a storm tearing through the house. In the bedroom across from Barbara's, her 16-year-old daughter, Rosaline, woke to the sound of boots pounding against the floor. Before she could even sit up, the door burst open and two armed agents rushed inside. One of them shouted for her not to move, while another swept the room with a rifle. Rosaline froze where she sat, blankets still wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. An agent forced her to the floor beside the bed, the cold metal barrel of a rifle hovering only inches from her face. The body camera attached to his vest would later capture the moment, clearly the girl's hands trembling as she tried to understand why strangers with guns were suddenly in her bedroom. In the room next door, 11-year-old Namdi stood beside his bookshelf, paralyzed. He had been awake just long enough to hear the explosion downstairs before the door to his room flew open. A tall agent in tactical gear stepped inside, weapon raised, shouting commands the boy barely understood. Namdi didn't move. He couldn't. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at the rifle pointed toward him, his small hands lifted halfway in the air the way he had seen people do on television. A dark stain slowly spread across the front of his pajama pants, but the agents didn't notice or didn't care. Back in the hallway, Barbara lay pinned to the floor, while the sound of drawers being ripped open and furniture overturned echoed through the house. She twisted her head just enough to see the boots of agents moving past her, carrying rifles and shouting to one another as they cleared each room. Her voice cut through the noise again, stronger this time despite the pressure on her spine. "I told you, I'm a federal judge. You're making a mistake." The agent kneeling on her back didn't even look down. "Yeah," he muttered flatly. "Sure you are." Standing in the doorway at the end of the hall was the man responsible for the entire operation. Senior Agent Craig Loomis watched the scene unfold, with his arms folded across his chest, his expression calm and unreadable. To him, this looked like any other raid. Just another suspect, another house, another operation carried out before sunrise. He had authorized every second of it. And at that moment, he believed completely that the woman lying face down on the floor in front of him was not a judge at all, but a dangerous foreign spy hiding in plain sight. Senior Agent Craig Loomis had spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation inside federal law enforcement. At 46 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he knew exactly how the world worked. He had joined Homeland Security not long after the attacks of September 11th, when the country was pouring resources into counterintelligence and anti-terror operations. In those early years, Loomis learned quickly that the cases that attracted the most attention were the ones that looked dramatic. Early morning raids, foreign espionage accusations, headlines that suggested a threat had been stopped just in time. Those were the operations that got supervisors noticed in Washington. Over the years, Loomis leaned into that reputation. Inside the agency, some colleagues described him as aggressive. Others used a different word, reckless. Several of his previous investigations had collapsed before reaching trial, quietly dismissed when prosecutors determined the evidence was too weak to hold up in court. In at least 2 of those cases, fellow agents filed internal complaints claiming Loomis had exaggerated intelligence reports or pushed confidential sources to say things they could not verify. But none of those complaints had ever gone anywhere. The reports were reviewed, filed away, and the investigations continued as if nothing had happened. Part of the reason was Loomis's relationship with his section chief, Supervisory Special Agent Donna Kessler. Kessler had overseen Loomis's unit for 6 years and had signed off on most of his major warrants. She believed he was bold, the kind of investigator willing to take risks others avoided. In private conversations with colleagues, she sometimes described him as someone who swung for the fences. In other words, Loomis pursued cases that could become headlines. If they succeeded, they justified budgets, promotions, and media coverage. If they failed, the details often faded quietly behind closed doors. But recently, Loomis had been under pressure. For nearly 2 years, he had been trying to secure a promotion to Assistant Special Agent in Charge, a position that would move him up the ladder of federal leadership. Promotions at that level rarely came from routine paperwork or quiet investigations. They came from cases that attracted national attention. Loomis needed something big, something that would prove he was the agent capable of uncovering a serious national security threat. So, when a routine intelligence sweep produced a name that seemed to connect a successful black professional to a foreign country considered politically sensitive, Loomis saw more than just a data point. He saw an opportunity. In his mind, the pieces began to fit together into the outline of a case that could make his career. The name on that list was Barbara Okwuosa-Admey, and by the time Loomis finished building his theory, he had convinced himself that the respected woman living quietly in that Maryland home was not a judge at all, but a covert asset connected to Iranian intelligence. The reality of who Barbara Okwuosa-Admey actually was could not have been more different from the picture Craig Loomis had built in his investigation. Barbara had been born in Baltimore, the daughter of Nigerian immigrants who had come to the United States decades earlier with little more than determination and a belief in education. Her father, Professor Samuel Okwuosa, spent most of his life teaching biology at a community college. Her mother worked long hours as a hospital administrator. In their home, discipline and study were not optional. They were expected. Barbara followed that path with remarkable focus. She earned her undergraduate degree from Spelman College, one of the most respected historically black colleges in the country. From there, she was accepted to Harvard Law School, where she graduated near the top of her class. Professors described her as methodical and sharp, the kind of student who prepared more thoroughly than anyone else in the room. After graduation, she clerked for a federal appellate judge on the Fourth Circuit, one of the most competitive positions in the legal world. Soon after, she joined the United States Department of Justice as a federal prosecutor. Ironically, the field she chose was national security, the same area Craig Loomis now claimed she had betrayed. For 8 years, she worked on complex investigations involving foreign intelligence threats, financial crimes, and international terrorism cases. Colleagues respected her for her attention to detail and her refusal to cut corners, even when the pressure to move quickly was intense. 4 years before the raid, Barbara's career reached its highest point. She was nominated to serve as a federal judge on the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. The Senate confirmed her appointment after a lengthy review of her record, and she took the bench with a reputation for fairness and careful legal reasoning. Within the legal community, she became known as a judge who took constitutional protections seriously, especially in cases involving government surveillance and civil liberties. Outside the courtroom, Barbara's life was far quieter. Her husband, Dr. Chukwu Okuwosa Admi, had been a respected cardiologist in Washington, D.C. 2 years earlier, he had died after a short but brutal battle with pancreatic cancer. Since then, Barbara had been raising their 2 children largely on her own. Mornings were often a blur of preparing breakfast, packing lunches, and getting Rosaline and Namdi ready for school before heading to the courthouse for a full docket of federal cases. Neighbors knew her as polite and reserved. On weekends, she could often be seen walking with her children to church or helping Namdi ride his bike on the sidewalk in front of their house. It was a quiet life, one defined by responsibility, discipline, and a deep respect for the law she had sworn to uphold. Yet on that March morning, as she sat zip-tied in her kitchen while armed agents tore through her home, none of that history seemed to matter. To the men moving through the rooms with rifles and evidence bags, Barbara Okuwosa Admi was not a judge, not a mother, and not a respected public servant. To them, she was simply a suspect. 3 months before the raid, Craig Loomis had been reviewing data from a routine intelligence sweep. The system flagged individuals who, in the agency's language, had potential connections to nations of concern. Most of the time, those alerts meant nothing. A travel record, a distant family connection, a financial transfer overseas. Normally, analysts cleared them quickly and moved on. But when Loomis saw the name Barbara Okuwosa Admi, he paused. At first, the connection seemed almost insignificant. Decades earlier, Barbara's father had traveled to Tehran in 1994 to attend an academic medical conference. It was a short trip, just a few days, organized by an international university program. The event had nothing to do with politics or intelligence, but in Loomis's mind, that single detail became the beginning of something much larger. He began pulling records, searching for anything that might support the idea that Barbara herself had hidden ties to Iran. The more he looked, the more he convinced himself that ordinary details were actually signs of something suspicious. Bank transfers Barbara had sent to elderly relatives in Lagos were described in his notes as possible covert financial channels. Her attendance at an international judicial conference in The Hague, an event organized by the U.S. State Department itself, was written into his draft report as a potential meeting with foreign operatives. Every piece of information was twisted until it seemed to fit the narrative Loomis had already decided was true. What the file did not contain was just as important. There was no corroborating intelligence from the CIA, no alert from the FBI, no intercepted communications from the NSA, no confidential informant claiming to have spoken with Barbara, no surveillance suggesting she had ever met with a foreign intelligence officer. The entire case rested on speculation and carefully worded assumptions. Still, Loomis began writing the affidavit for a search warrant. Page by page, he presented his theory as if it were established fact. He described Barbara as a highly placed legal professional who might be secretly passing information to Iranian intelligence networks. The language was technical, layered with references to national security threats and foreign influence operations. To anyone reading it quickly, the document created the impression of a serious and urgent case. By the time Loomis finished the affidavit, the narrative looked convincing enough on paper. All it needed now was a judge's signature. And once that signature was placed on the warrant, the quiet home in Silver Spring would suddenly become the target of a federal counterintelligence raid. The affidavit landed on the desk of Magistrate Judge Howard Pouet late on a Thursday afternoon. Pouet was 61 years old and had served on the federal bench for more than a decade. Among attorneys and law enforcement agents who regularly appeared in his courtroom, he had a reputation for efficiency. His docket moved quickly, and warrants rarely sat on his desk for long. On most days, that speed was seen as a strength, but on this day, it would become part of a much larger failure. Craig Loomis presented the affidavit as an urgent national security matter. The language was dense with references to foreign intelligence threats and the possibility that sensitive information might be leaving the country. In situations like that, magistrate judges often relied heavily on the credibility of the agents presenting the request. They assumed the investigator had already verified the facts. Judge Pouet began reading the document. 9 minutes later, he signed the warrant. He did not request supporting documents. He did not ask for confirmation from other agencies. He did not question the thin chain of assumptions that connected a 30-year-old academic trip to an allegation of espionage. With a single signature, the document became a federal search warrant. That warrant authorized Homeland Security Investigations agents to enter Barbara Okuosa-Admi's home, seize electronic devices, review financial records, and collect any materials they believed might relate to foreign intelligence activity. It also allowed them to conduct the operation without warning if agents believed announcing themselves might compromise the investigation. Back in Silver Spring, that piece of paper was already being put into action. Inside the house, agents moved quickly through every room with the efficiency of people who believed the law was firmly on their side. One team swept the living room, pulling electronics from shelves and placing them into clear evidence bags. Another group moved into Barbara's home office, opening drawers and removing laptops, external hard drives, and stacks of paperwork from her desk. Someone carried out a box filled with family photo albums. Another agent removed tablets from the children's bedrooms. In the kitchen, Barbara remained zip-tied to a chair. Her hair was still disheveled from being pulled out of bed. Her wrists were beginning to ache where the plastic restraints dug into her skin. She watched silently as agents walked past carrying pieces of her life in cardboard boxes. "Please," she said again, trying to keep her voice steady. "I want to call my attorney." An agent near the refrigerator shook his head without even looking at her. "You'll get your chance later." Minutes passed. Then more agents appeared carrying thick binders from her home office. Barbara recognized them immediately. They were judicial case files, active federal cases she was currently presiding over. A younger agent hesitated when he saw the labels on the folders. He glanced toward Craig Loomis, who had just stepped into the room. "Sir, are we supposed to be handling court documents?" Loomis barely looked up from the stack of papers in his hands. "Right now," he said flatly, "she's not a judge." He paused for a moment, then added quietly, "She's a suspect." 3 minutes after the flashbang shattered the living room window, a porch light flicked on across the street. The man who stepped outside was Bill Tavares, a 68-year-old retired firefighter who had lived on that block for nearly 30 years. Tavares had spent most of his career running into burning buildings, responding to emergencies most people only saw on television. That experience had given him a strong instinct for when something didn't feel right, and what he was seeing now felt very wrong. He stood on his porch in a bathrobe and slippers, squinting through the early morning darkness as the tactical vehicles idled along the curb. Agents in helmets and body armor moved quickly around the front of Barbara's house, their rifles raised as they disappeared through the broken door. A moment later, the echo of shouted commands spilled out onto the street. Tavares reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out his phone. He pressed record. From his vantage point across the street, he began capturing everything he could see. Agents moving in and out of the house, evidence boxes being carried down the front steps, clear plastic bags containing laptops and tablets. At one point, an agent walked past holding a framed photograph that had obviously come from inside the house. He paused near a vehicle, said something to a colleague, and both men laughed before placing the frame into a cardboard box. Tavares kept filming. 50 minutes into the raid, something else appeared in the upstairs window. The curtain shifted slightly, just enough for a face to become visible behind the glass. Even from across the street, Tavares could see the tears on Rosaline's cheeks as she looked outside, frightened and confused. The moment lasted only a few seconds before someone inside the house pulled the curtain shut. At one point, Tavares walked toward the police perimeter that had formed along the sidewalk. "Hey!" he called to one of the agents standing guard. "What's going on in there?" The agent didn't answer the question. "Sir, you need to return to your residence immediately." Tavares nodded and stepped back toward his porch, but he didn't stop recording. For the next 2 hours he stood there, quietly documenting the operation as it unfolded. He didn't know exactly what was happening inside the house, but he knew enough about emergencies to recognize when a situation looked excessive. Later that evening, sitting at his kitchen table with the footage still on his phone, Tavares would tell a local reporter something he had repeated many times during his years in the fire department. "I've seen houses raided for drugs. I've seen dangerous situations, but I've never seen anything like what they did to that woman and those kids." He paused for a moment before adding the part that mattered most. "And I knew somebody needed to see it." At 9:15 a.m., more than 3 hours after the first flashbang exploded inside her home, Barbara Okuosa Admi was finally allowed to make a phone call. Her hands were still bound in front of her when an agent placed a phone on the kitchen table. The house around her looked like it had been turned upside down. Drawers had been pulled out and dumped onto the floor. Cabinets stood open. Evidence boxes lined the hallway. Barbara took a slow breath and dialed a number she knew by memory. Obiora Nankwo answered on the second ring. Nankwo was not only a respected constitutional lawyer in Washington, D.C., he was also one of Barbara's oldest friends. They had met during their first year at Harvard Law School and had stayed close throughout their careers. When he heard Barbara's voice on the phone that morning, he knew immediately that something was wrong. "They broke into my house," she said calmly, though her voice carried the strain of the past several hours. "They say I'm being investigated for espionage. My children are here. I need you." Nankwo did not ask questions. He simply said he was on his way. 40 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up outside the damaged house in Silver Spring. Nankwo stepped out wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Pieces of the broken front door still lay scattered across the porch. One of the agents at the entrance stopped him immediately. "Sir, this is a federal investigation." Nankwo calmly handed over his identification. "I'm here as legal counsel for Judge Barbara Okuosa Admi." The agent hesitated for a moment before allowing him inside. The scene in the living room looked like the aftermath of a storm. Furniture had been moved aside. Boxes of seized materials were stacked near the wall, and several agents were still moving through the house, collecting electronics and paperwork. In the center of the kitchen, Barbara sat at the table, her wrists still marked red from the zip ties that had only recently been removed. Nankwo set his briefcase down and looked around the room, taking in every detail. Then he turned toward Craig Loomis. "My client," he said clearly enough for every body camera in the room to capture the words, "is a sitting United States federal district judge for the District of Columbia." The room went quiet. An agent standing near the hallway slowly lowered the folder he had been holding. Another looked toward Loomis as if waiting for instructions. For the first time since the raid began, uncertainty crept into the faces of the people in the room. Loomis remained standing near the living room table, a stack of documents in his hands. His expression didn't change, but his fingers stopped turning the pages. "We'll verify that," he replied. Nankwo's response came immediately. "You should have verified it before you put a flashbang through her window." Craig Loomis said nothing for a moment. The room remained quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of an evidence box being set down in the hallway. Then Loomis turned and walked toward the back door without another word. He stepped into the backyard and pulled out his phone. The cold morning air hung still around him as he dialed the number of his section chief, Supervisory Special Agent Donna Kessler. When she answered, Loomis spoke in a lower voice than he had used all morning. "We may have a situation," he said. Kessler didn't like the sound of that. She asked one question. "What kind of situation?" Loomis hesitated, then replied, "The subject claims she's a federal judge." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Kessler immediately opened the Federal Judiciary Personnel database on her computer. She typed in the name Barbara Okuosa Admi and waited for the system to respond. It took less than 2 minutes. The screen confirmed everything. Barbara Okuosa Admi, United States District Judge, District of Columbia, active appointment, presidential nomination, Senate confirmed. Kessler leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. Through the phone speaker, Loomis could hear the tension in her voice when she spoke again. "Craig, what have you done?" For several seconds, Loomis didn't answer. He simply stared across the backyard fence as if trying to process what that confirmation meant. If the information was correct, and it almost certainly was, then the raid they had just conducted had targeted a sitting federal judge. Worse still, agents had already seized documents from her home office, documents that might include active judicial case files. Inside the house, the body cameras were still recording. Agents moved more slowly now, whispering to one another as word of the conversation began to spread. A young agent near the kitchen counter looked toward the hallway where several evidence boxes had already been stacked. "Those files came from her office," he said quietly. Another agent shook his head. "You're telling me we just took case files from a federal judge?" Back in the yard, Loomis finally ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. When he returned to the house, his face looked exactly the same as it had earlier that morning, calm, controlled, unreadable. But his next words changed the entire tone of the operation. "Start wrapping it up," he told the team. No explanation, no apology, just an order to finish the raid. Inside the kitchen, Obiora Nankwo watched him closely. The lawyer had already opened his briefcase and was writing notes across a yellow legal pad. When Loomis approached the table, Nankwo looked up. "You've just raided the home of a federal judge," he said evenly. "You seized judicial documents, personal records, and electronics belonging to her children." He paused for a moment before finishing the thought. "This is not going away." At approximately 10 a.m., more than 4 hours after the raid had begun, one of the agents finally approached the kitchen table with a small pair of cutters. Without a word, he snipped the plastic restraints from Barbara Okuosa Admi's wrists. The tight zip ties fell to the floor. Deep red grooves circled both of her hands where the plastic had dug into her skin. Barbara slowly stood from the chair. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked down the hallway. "My children," she said quietly. An agent nodded and stepped away. A few seconds later, 11-year-old Namdi appeared in the doorway. The moment he saw his mother standing there, he ran across the kitchen and wrapped both arms around her waist so tightly she had to brace herself against the counter to keep her balance. His small body trembled as he pressed his face into her side. Barbara placed one hand gently on the back of his head. For nearly 20 minutes, the boy didn't let go. He didn't say a single word. Rosaline came into the kitchen a little later. One of the agents escorted her down the hallway, but she refused to look at him. She walked past the broken cabinets and scattered papers and sat down slowly in one of the dining chairs. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. She stared straight ahead at the wall. The tears from earlier had dried, but something about the look in her eyes unsettled everyone in the room more than the crying had. It was the distant stillness of someone trying to process something they didn't fully understand. Around them, the house looked as if it had been torn apart. Drawers had been dumped onto the floor. Closet doors hung open with clothes scattered across the hallway. In Barbara's home office, entire stacks of documents had been removed from the desk and replaced with empty spaces where evidence boxes had once been. The worst damage was in the study that had belonged to her late husband. Books had been pulled from shelves, desk drawers had been emptied, papers lay scattered across the carpet where agents had searched for anything they believed might connect Barbara to foreign intelligence. On the upstairs hallway floor, a framed photograph from her parents' wedding lay face down, the glass cracked by a long diagonal fracture. Barbara moved slowly through the house with Obiora Nankwo walking beside her. She held her phone in one hand, documenting everything. The broken door, the overturned furniture, the empty shelves. She spoke quietly as she recorded. "They took my children's laptops." A few steps later, she photographed the empty filing cabinet in her office. "They took my case files." Then she paused beside a half-open box where old letters had once been stored. "And they took the letters my father wrote to my mother." Her voice remained calm, almost clinical, as if she were cataloging evidence in a courtroom rather than the ruins of her own home. But everyone standing nearby understood exactly what those words meant. The damage was no longer just part of a raid. It was now the beginning of a legal disaster. The next morning, the story began to spread far beyond the quiet street in Silver Spring. Bill Tavares had barely slept. The images from the raid kept replaying in his mind: the flash of the grenade, the agents carrying boxes from the house, the terrified face of the teenage girl at the upstairs window. By mid-morning on March 2nd, he made a decision. Sitting at his kitchen table, he attached the video from his phone to an email and sent it to a reporter at a local television station. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. The first news report aired just after noon. The headline alone was enough to shock viewers. Homeland Security agents raid home of sitting federal judge. By late afternoon, every major network had picked up the story. Legal analysts appeared on television panels, trying to explain how something like this could happen. Former federal prosecutors called it one of the most disturbing abuses of investigative power they had ever seen. Civil rights organizations released statements demanding an immediate investigation. But what truly fueled the outrage was the video. Tavares's footage showed the early morning raid from across the street. Tactical vehicles, armed agents entering the house, evidence boxes being carried outside. In one moment that quickly spread across social media, an agent walked down the front steps holding a framed photograph taken from inside the house. He said something to a colleague, and both men laughed before placing it in a box. The video was viewed more than 4 million times in a single day. One particular frame became the image everyone remembered. It showed agents in full tactical gear carrying labeled evidence boxes down the front steps, while, in the second-floor window behind them, the face of a child was barely visible behind the curtain. The child's mouth was open in a silent cry. By that evening, pressure on Homeland Security leadership was growing rapidly. Senior officials in Washington held emergency calls as reporters began asking questions about the raid. Within hours, the agency announced that Senior Agent Craig Loomis had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. His section chief, Donna Kessler, was also suspended while the circumstances of the warrant approval were reviewed. Magistrate Judge Howard Puett, the man who had signed the warrant after only a brief review, made no public statement, but sources close to the court later confirmed that he had quietly retained legal counsel. Meanwhile, Obura Nankwo moved quickly through the legal system. On the afternoon of March 2nd, he filed an emergency motion asking a federal court to unseal the affidavit that had justified the raid. The request was granted within hours due to what the court described as extraordinary constitutional concerns. That evening, the affidavit became public, and when legal experts began reading the document on live television, the reaction was immediate. The case against Barbara Okwosa-Admi wasn't strong. It was shockingly thin. The alleged Iranian connection was based almost entirely on a single academic trip taken by her father more than 30 years earlier. The so-called covert financial transfers were ordinary family support payments sent overseas and fully documented in tax records. The supposed clandestine meeting in The Hague had been an official conference organized by the United States government itself. There were no intelligence reports, no confidential informants, no supporting evidence from any other federal agency. By the end of the evening, the conclusion being discussed across the country was no longer whether the raid had been aggressive. The question now was far more serious. How had a warrant this weak ever been approved at all? By the morning of March 3, 2026, the story had become impossible for federal authorities to ignore. Investigations were opening across multiple agencies at the same time. The Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General launched a formal probe into Senior Agent Craig Loomis, his team, and every supervisor who had approved the operation. The Department of Justice opened a separate review focused on a different question: whether the raid had interfered with the functioning of the federal judiciary itself. If that proved true, the consequences could reach far beyond a single investigation. At the same time, the FBI quietly began examining the affidavit Loomis had submitted to obtain the warrant. Their focus was simple but serious: whether evidence had been knowingly misrepresented. If investigators determined that Loomis had fabricated or intentionally distorted facts in order to secure the warrant, it could constitute a federal crime. On Capitol Hill, members of Congress from both parties began requesting briefings. Letters were sent to the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Attorney General, and the Director of National Intelligence demanding answers. Civil rights organizations called for public hearings. The Federal Judges Association, an organization that rarely speaks publicly, released a statement describing the raid as a direct threat to judicial independence. Meanwhile, Craig Loomis sat at home on paid administrative leave. Through his attorney, he released a short written statement claiming he had acted in good faith based on available intelligence. Donna Kessler declined to comment publicly. Magistrate Judge Howard Puett remained silent. though court sources confirmed he had quietly stepped away from several cases on his docket. But none of those developments mattered much inside the house in Silver Spring. Rosaline had barely spoken since the morning of the raid. Loud sounds made her flinch. A door closing too quickly could send her heart racing. Namdi had begun waking up in the middle of the night, afraid to sleep alone in the same room where armed strangers had once pointed a rifle at him. One night, just before dawn, he walked quietly into his mother's bedroom and climbed onto the bed beside her. He looked up at her with the kind of uncertainty no 11-year-old should have to carry. "Mama, did you do something bad?" Barbara held his face gently in both hands. "No," she said softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." She said the words with absolute certainty. But as she looked around the room, the broken door downstairs, the boarded-up window where the flashbang had exploded, she also understood something else. The damage done to her family could not be undone by investigations or headlines. Later that day, Barbara released a short written statement through her attorney. It was only a few sentences long, but it quickly spread across news outlets and social media. "I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States," she wrote. "On March 1st, agents of the federal government broke into my home and violated that Constitution in front of my children. I will pursue accountability for every person responsible, not for my sake, but because if this can happen to a federal judge, it can happen to anyone." And that was the question now echoing across the country. How had a system designed to protect the law turned its power against one of its own? The investigations were still ongoing. No one had been charged. No one had been fired. The seized judicial files had not yet been returned. But one thing had changed. The cameras had been rolling. The evidence was preserved. The names of the people responsible were now public. And the woman they had dragged onto the hallway floor in her pajamas, believing she was no one important, was a federal judge who understood exactly how the law worked. Which meant this story was not over. Not even close.